Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us all today. Welcome to the CRDG webinar on strengthening cannabinoid R&D in the UK. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Phillips. I'm on the advisory board, one of the advisory board members of the CRDG. We set this group up earlier this year. We're a group of academics, researchers, clinicians, industry and patients, and we really have the specific aim of propelling scientific research and development of pharmaceutical cannabinoid-related products in the UK. So today's webinar is kind of based around the first report that we launched we launched earlier this year in July. You can get a copy of the report if you need to via our website. And we're delighted to be joined today by one of the co-authors, Zach Bellman. So he's going to take us first of all through a short summary of the report. And then we've got some CRDG members that have joined us today. So welcome to Dr. Andy Yates from Artelo Biosciences and also Rob Bennett from Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies, or OCT. We hope we have Clarissa from OCT joining us a little bit later on as well when her schedule allows. So they're going to be talking about issues faced in research. You might have seen the Times report that came out a couple of weeks ago. Andy and Artelo Biosciences were featured there as a case study. And Rob and OCT are going to be talking about experience with licensing and the Home Office as well, because as we know, there's quite some issues around this area in order for us to be able to advance R&D cannabinoid technology in the UK. So what we will do as well, we will have time for questions after the short presentations by each of our panelists today. So if you want to put a question in, I suggest maybe put it into the chat box and then I'll be able to read it out when we do the questions at the end. So thanks very much. And I think what we'll do is we'll start with Zach, and then Andy and Rob will be able to introduce themselves once they start their presentations. So over to you, Zach. Thanks very much. One of the co-authors of the CRDG Cannabinoid R&D report.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. So, okay. What I'm going to do is just whiz through some of the highlight, kind of the top line information, but you can read the original report for more detail. It was also, the original report was whittled down to be more concise to a smaller level. And I've tried to keep the references to a bare minimum, but there are kind of some crucial footnotes that you can delve into to, look into the topic in more detail. And so this is more just talk about some of the motivation and the rationale, and then to hear from the other companies, to hear from Andy, Rob, and have a discussion around it. So it's always good to start with the thanks. Just want to thank Andy, John McCracken, who is a former civil servant at the CQC, who helped guide the report. His discussions were really invaluable. Clarissa, Jeremy, Bill, Steve, the CRDG team, Rob, and generally to thank the scientific research community, because it is difficult to do this research and they have to navigate a lot of, bureaucratic complexities. And because of that, they need, a lot more motivation is needed to kind of, actually operate and, run labs in this space. And obviously, thanks to everyone who's attending. So this first slide, I promise I won't do this with all the slides, but I am just going to read it as is. I included this quote at the start of the report. But basically, when the new government administration came in, I was looking at all the senior ministers that Keir appointed. I was kind of Googling each of their names, their stance on cannabis and cannabinoids, and going through the debates. And I found that the current Minister for Secondary Care, Karen Smith, who's, I believe, the MP in Bristol, she said this last year, April the 20th, 2023, 5 years later, it's totally unacceptable that so little progress has been made. It would be helpful if the minister could set out what steps he is taking to empower and accelerate research in this space. I hope he will not dodge the question by saying that the issue is simply one for clinicians. The government has a responsibility. The minister is nodding, and we await his reply with interest. There seems to be a lack of urgency on the issue, which is concerning. People are suffering right now. We have heard again this afternoon about children who are fitting 100 times or more. Accessing care is, in some cases, pushing families to the brink of destitution. We should do everything we can to support those people. If research is needed before clinicians feel comfortable prescribing, then it is incumbent on the government to support clinicians. We need more streamlined clinical trials and better engagement with clinicians. We do not want to be back here in another 2 years having a rerun of this debate. And then she goes on. You can find the full debate online. It's worth a read. But my point is that at the time she was an MP, now she's the current Minister of State for Secondary Care. We're going to be talking, about palliative care and, important issues that I believe that she has, some responsibility, but we all know politicians can, be hypocritical in some ways, and they've got different, factors that they need to consider. But what I'm saying is it's in there, it's definitely in her consciousness, and this kind of pressure, it exists out there, and we don't want to be rerunning the same old debates. So, okay. So a brief overview of just kind of the headings. Talking about strengthening the research environment.
Your slides aren't moving for me, so you might, I don't know whether you want to put it in presenter mode or something like that, but it's still on the first page.
It's still on the first page?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's just the title slides, Zach.
Okay. Can you see that now?
It
So
says
the present situation. I think you're a slide behind where you want to be for some reason.
Oh, God, my computer's playing up, so present situation. Something's gone there.
that says report overview now.
Okay. I'm going to stay in this view then.
Can you make it full screen because we've got a lot of.
I've lost my mouse. Sorry. Let's see.
Okay, don't worry if it's. We can just carry on.
Is that working now? If I change?
No, we're still in PowerPoint mode, but I think if we move on, because I think we can read this.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just whiz through some of these points. So, basically, the report goes on to talk about the present situation. We talk about the Drugs and Firearms Licensing Unit and outline some of the information there. And then I briefly talk about the R&D obstacles which affect different levels of research, both from the preclinical and fundamental and the theoretical research to the clinical trials, and then the business opportunities. There's kind of three distinct classes of areas that are being affected by the licensing situation here in the UK. Obviously, they're not like completely distinct, and they are related. And then I end with some of the solutions, which are from the barriers to research review from the ACMD. They talk about approved research organisations, approved research projects, rescheduling, and possible exemptions. This is essentially the approach to the report I had, which was a simple synthesis of the qualitative experience of Schedule 1 drug researchers and the research coming out from academia, synthesized with the barriers to research review that the ACMT put. And essentially, I kind of joined these two together. And then I was hearing from the CRDG members the difficulties they were having. And my background's from in academia, where it is a more trusted institution and research environment. And personally, I was shocked to hear the kind of bureaucratic hurdles that a lot of the private companies were experiencing. This is the last slide, just to say a bit of a historical overview. But and I don't want to focus on the obstacles here, but this is from the late 1930s and early 1940s. The Nobel laureate Lord Todd, who worked with cannabinoids, was also having issues with the Home Office. He had to register his cannabis products with them, and he had to provide 25 reprints of any papers on the subject to the Bureau of Drugs and Indecent Publications. Well, my point here is that he went on to win a Nobel Prize working with the synthesis of nucleotides. And I believe that any of the companies and any of the scientists working with cannabinoids have the potential to, create really innovative class of medicines, create, whether it's, working on the model of GW or, revealing, scientific mechanisms amongst other drugs that are working on the endocannabinoid system or looking at the fundamental science. This is just to say that there's, a strong history of cannabinoid research in the UK, and some of these have been the best scientists that, have been around, like Lord Todd. And I believe it can continue moving on forward. So that's kind of my introduction to the topic. I just want to say thanks for listening. And moving on to the discussion with Andy, Rob, and everyone else. And get in touch if you have any more questions. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks there, Zach. So as I say, the report, if you haven't had a chance to have your copy, it is available on the CRDG website to download there. And you'll see the summary section of all the points. And I think what would be really great now is to move on to some sort of real life experience in the industry area. So Andy, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and to talk a little bit around the issues faced in research, as say, sort of coming off the back of that Times article as well that was out a couple of weeks ago. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Zach. I thought you were going to do a nice segue there from Nobel laureate winner to me.
Oh, we missed it. We missed it. Sorry.
Well, at the pace the Home Office is currently working at, there's no Nobel Prize coming our way soon. But joking aside, I think it is really important for people to try and understand what type of issues we talk about. I also would like to sort of highlight that I actually think, and I hope the Times article came across, that I think there's a really easy solution. And there's a really easy solution not designed by any one of us sitting on this call, but by the Home Office's own independent scientific advisory committee, the ACMD, who have issued now 3 guidances or 3 recommendations since 2016. Zach rightly has focused on the most recent one, delivered in December 2023. But effectively, the scientific community that the Home Office relies on for independent advice has equally recognised the issue that we're going to talk about and has provided some recommendations and solutions to that, which I personally think is the easiest way forward for us, is to say to the Home Office, pick up that paper and implement. But my background, I'm a UK registered pharmacist, so very aware of and used and been exposed to the misuse of drugs regulations throughout my career, mainly in community and hospital pharmacy. I then worked for AstraZeneca for nearly 12 years in a variety of different roles, so I've had the sort of big pharma experience. And my current role is the Chief Scientific Officer for Artelo Biosciences, which is a US listed, but UK R&D focused, i.e. all of our R&D is either directed from or conducted here in the UK. We are developing 3 drugs that affect the endocannabinoid system. Drug number 1 is in the clinic for use with patients with cancer and anorexia. The idea is that it puts weight and hopefully muscle onto these patients. And that's the drug I've had the most problems with the Home Office with. Our second drug, which is a modifier of the human endocannabinoid system, is a drug that we are actually going to take our clinical trials to the US with, simply because we've had so many problems here in the UK. So I do believe that that's a loss for UK PLC. And ultimately, we all know how these things work, is that where you tend to do your first study will certainly be part of continued studies thereafter. So the US is going to get all of those subsequent studies. And then it will be a debate of whether we move back to the UK, which I think is a great shame for the heritage of the science, and particularly cannabinoid science here in the UK. And that's the reason why, 1, we've been a participant to the CRDG's membership and this report, and 2, which is why we chose to go onto the record with the Times newspaper to put just how bad it's got for us as a company. And our third drug, which I've also had some poor dealings with the Home Office on, is a CBD derivative. It's a CBD co-crystal, effectively takes insoluble CBD and solubilizes it, which makes things a lot easier if you want to work with CBD in a tablet. And my experience, I guess, with the Home Office, if you wish, started with my PhD. Prior to all of this happening, I was working at Nottingham University researching cannabinoids back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I remember being fascinated when I was speaking to my supervisors in this space that we wouldn't be working with THC. The reason we wouldn't be working with THC was because of the controls around it. But at that time, there was no such thing as the Psychoactive Substances Act or the Benzimidazole Cannabinoid Act. So we actually chose to work with cannabinoids that were totally synthetic, didn't resemble THC in any way, but were potent agonists or antagonists of the CB receptors. So right back from the very beginning of my research into cannabinoids, we were looking for ways, or people were looking for ways to try and avoid the Home Office. Maybe that should have been my flag to work somewhere else, but alas, I stick to what I believe in, and here we are. So my main, I guess, concern with the Home Office as a licensing unit and regulator of controlled substances is that they are simply not resourced or skilled to do that job in the medicinal space. So as Zach highlighted, we are actually dealing with the drugs and firearm licensing unit. So the majority of the people on their staff are actually involved with whether to issue a shotgun license to a farmer or an amateur or professional shooter. And I think that really just puts what we're talking about into context. We're talking about doing drug development projects with IND or IMP, which is the terms used to go into the regulator packages that can be tens of thousands of pages long of scientific data or evidence that we need to supply to the regulators in order to move our drug into human trials, and from there into later human trials. And quite frankly, the Home Office can't have a conversation on that complexity. That is not what they're there for, and they've made that clear. But you can imagine that drug development in itself is a very tough business, lots of risks, lots of unknowns, very long time frames. And to add in the complexity of a regulator that understands nothing about what you wish to achieve, how you wish to achieve it, or the fact that you are doing this to further the good for humans and add medicines into unmet needs, just quite frankly makes it more complex than it should be. And so our key recommendation is that actually this licensing for controlled substances actually is not undertaken by the Home Office anymore. It's actually undertaken by the MHRA, who of course are resourced or could be resourced. That's one of the things that makes them an attractive unit. They can be fit for size, size to fit. So there's an ability there for the MHRA to expand their employees to cope with demand, and of course they're well versed in how you develop drugs. So conceptually, if the move from licensing decisions move from Home Office firearms unit over to the MHRA, our regulator for medicines, I believe everyone who wished to participate in that licensing journey would have a much easier ride. And the reason being is that they'd simply understand what you needed to do, could guide you in the right places. We're not asking for any free passes, by the way. I don't think any company who's a member of the CRDG is asking for that. What we're asking for is an understanding and the respect of what we're actually trying to achieve, and to remove as many of the hurdles which exist as possible. And I just want to highlight, as I sort of finish up my piece on this, what I'm trying to get at here, which is our third drug product in our portfolio is a CBD co-crystal. So it takes synthetically pure CBD. That's our choice. We're using synthetically pure CBD. We know that CBD can be obtained in good quality and purity from plants as well, but we're using the synthetic route. And we put it with, I guess, an inert filler. And at the end of that, we have our CBD co-crystal. We have tried to approach the Home Office I can't count how many times we've tried to approach them, including through our lawyers, just asking for conversation. Because if you read their guidance, as we all know, CBD sits in a grey area, and it says that we understand that pure CBD is not controlled, and the Home Office's position is, but we fail to see that you can have it pure, or that it doesn't degrade to a controlled substance. That's really unhelpful, right? That's a really unhelpful position to have. The MHRA wouldn't accept that position. They imagine them saying, we believe it's pure, and that if it's pure, it's okay, but we believe you can't get it pure, and therefore we're going to treat it as an impure substance. And we've got a wealth of data that we want to share with the Home Office, whether that's for us as an individual company or hopefully at a wider level, so they can actually start to understand that some of their written guidance is not true, simply not true. You can get undetectable levels of THC if you come from a synthetic pathway, particularly if you're going through a process which then further refines and refines. Equally, we want to know what levels they would accept, and they just won't have this conversation. And they won't have that conversation because I suspect these are the guys that are more used to giving shotgun licenses out than giving medical innovation a chance to succeed at the right pace. So you can tell I'm pretty passionate about it. You can tell Artelo's pretty passionate about it. I don't think we did ourselves any. There was certainly no sort of immediate positive value of going on the record with what we've done. We've had to tell our investors and shareholders sort of as it was, but we've never hidden anything from them either. They know we face delays because of the Home Office. And I can go into, when we get to the discussion session, what some of the specifics were, particularly on the first project. But I think generally I wanted my message to be that I really don't think it's the right way to continue with Home Office leading licensing decisions on medical controlled substances. I'm obviously interested in cannabinoids, but it extends beyond cannabinoids. I think there's a solution. In fact, there's 3 solutions waiting for the Home Office, all written by their independent scientists, the ACMD, and they just need to pick that up and start implementing some of this. And the third is that it has had a dramatic impact on my company's view of R&D, because we're no longer going to place trials here in the UK. We're going to move our trials elsewhere, and of course all of that budget and expertise moves elsewhere with it. And I hope one day we can bring that research back to the UK. But currently, I wouldn't necessarily be pushing a fight with my board of directors to do that, given the unacceptable delays we faced with previous projects. So I hope that gives a sort of a decent scope of what we're about, where the Home Office has played its role in some of our decision making, and hopefully an easy or reasonably easy solution to improving the situation for all.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andy. And thank you for staying on from your PhD in this area and retaining your passion as well, because I think, you've really highlighted there, for those that maybe aren't fully aware, just, how disjointed, and disruptive this whole process is and how difficult. And, it's great that we've got Artelo on board with the CRDG and also obviously OCT as well. Rob's going to be talking next. And that, maybe we've got some strength in numbers here as well to really be able to start presenting this united voice around the R&D. And certainly that's a large part of our work with the CRDG, working with George Freeman MP and groups to start trying to make some changes in these areas. So I know we've got some great questions coming up, which will kind of tie in some of the information that you've just presented. So I think we'll move on to Rob now and give an introduction. I'm trying to think of some sort of Nobel laureate segue in, but I can't either, Rob. Very sorry. So we'll move on from Manchester down to Oxford area. And if you'd like to introduce yourself, Rob, one of the CRDG members, OCT, and he's going to discuss a little bit about your experiencing with licensing and the Home Office as well. Thanks very much, Rob.
Yeah, so thank you, Elizabeth and Zach so far. So I'm just going to talk a bit more about the legal. So I'm the General Counsel for Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies. Like the other members of the CRDG, we believe, passionately in the sort of therapeutic potential benefits of cannabinoids. And so we have a library of 500 plus cannabinoid derivatives, and we currently have 4 programs. So our first program is a new kind of entity into chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. Our second program is a pressurized metered dose inhaler, which has a combination of CBD, THC. And then programs 3 and 4 are an undisclosed neuropathic pain, and then the program 4 is in oncology. And hopefully with 500 sort of derivatives, then hopefully there'll be sort of further programs after that. And so just wanted to talk really go into a bit more detail on the legal side of what we're trying to do with this report. So currently the UK, as we all sort of know and recognise, is a leader on a global stage in life sciences as a whole, but also there's some really sort of notable achievements in the cannabinoid space, particularly with GW Pharma, who had Epidiolex and Sativex, which have international recognition. The issue is that despite this lead position, we have some regulatory barriers, particularly around cannabinoid, which are hampering the sort of further progress of our R&D in the UK. And with it, and the concern of the CRDG is that if we don't try and do something about these barriers, the UK risks losing that position to other countries who have a more favourable regulatory framework. And that would just be sad, both for the loss of intellectual capital in the UK to elsewhere, but also the impact on the economy as well. So the challenge is that under the Misuse of Drugs Act regulations, which in and of itself is sort of a little bit of a shame, sort of setting us down down a path of misuse rather than actual sort of proper use. The Misuse of Drugs regulations schedules drugs in different levels depending on how the perceived dangers to society and acceptability. And in 2018, the medicinal cannabis, medical cannabis, was rescheduled from Schedule 1, which is the strictest schedule, down to Schedule 2. And the idea is that would allow greater R&D in the cannabinoid space as generally. However, the challenge is that that many cannabinoids, particularly in the sort of purest form, remain as Schedule 1. And this really inhibits the R&D. And so Schedule 1 drugs are generally viewed, although this isn't explicitly referenced in the regulations, but it's sort of the narrative around the regulations is that often Schedule 1 drugs are viewed as having no medicinal benefit or therapeutic potential, which members of the CRDG are strongly opposed to, sort of in their view. And so because it's Schedule 1, that, as Andy mentioned, means that in addition to all the other regulations we have around clinical trials, we have this further licensing requirement from the Home Office's drugs and firearms licensing unit. So these are the guys who are checking that if you're into clay pigeon shooting, you have a locked box, you have a gun safe in your house, and you have a clean criminal record, etc. And so their view, and in no way are we having to go at these guys at all. It's just these are the rules we're playing to, we're sort of playing to the whistle, as it were. But their approach, the approach they take, and rightly so, because that's the remit they're being given, is very security focused. So it's designed, and it's not designed for scientific research. So the Schedule 1 classification adds excessive administrative burden, and particularly when you're looking at multi-site clinical trials, each site must have this Schedule 1 license. So that makes it just a real sort of burden. OCT, ourselves, we never we have nothing to do with leaves or flowers, cannabis leaves or flowers. everything's synthetic. So it's not like we are deriving from cannabis. We are always dealing in that sort of synthetic world. So the barriers to research that this creates then is that it's more expensive, it's really complex, but it also creates delays, both sort of the preclinical and clinical trials. If we were to do clinical trials in the UK, each hospital or CRO or site has to have its own licensing, which really adds additional hurdles over and above our own to our sort of partners. And so due to these sort of many regulatory hurdles, the UK is losing out, as I mentioned at the start, to jurisdictions where there is a far more favourable regulatory framework, and that's just intellectual capital and sort of economic benefit going out the door. So the report that sort of Zach largely authored proposed three sort of buckets really of proposed reforms with sort of three potential sort of benefits to the UK. So that was the first one, was the shift of licensing responsibility. So as mentioned, currently the licensing is dealt with by the Drugs and Firearms Licensing Unit in the Home Office. And so moving that over to the Department of Health and the MHRA would align it far more with actually where we're at, which is we are doing proper clinical trials. We're using these drugs for proper reasons, and it's not about misuse, it's about proper use for the benefit of humans with sort of given conditions. And so that would help reduce delay, reduce burden, and reduce costs as well. The second broad sort of heading is research exemption. So as I mentioned, each site in a trial has to have its own licensing. So whether that's a hospital or whether that's a university, and quite often in the UK, those institutions don't have the necessary Schedule 1 licensing, which then makes, first of all, trying to find a partner in the UK difficult, but then further makes it difficult around patient recruitment and actually having proper clinical trials in the UK. So some sort of exemption for those research organisations, so you can just have almost de facto Schedule 1 license, or at least exemption from needing that licensing. And then the third category is the rescheduling of cannabinoids and licensing for clinical trials. So as I mentioned previously, by and large, the narrative around why a drug is in Schedule 1 is because it has no medicinal value or therapeutic potential. But as the CRDG members are showing, as well as our sort of other similar organisations around the world, increasingly cannabinoid is, we're proving on the out that cannabinoids have medicinal value, have therapeutic potential, and so absolutely should be taken from Schedule 1 to a lower schedule. And then in addition to that, there's this idea of like centralizing the licensing. So once we're into this sort of the MHRA world, kind of what we can do to sort of streamline that. And so the idea, so this would hopefully then have three potential benefits for the UK, and sort of economic and health. So the first is attracting investment. Removing these barriers isn't going to immediately open the floodgates. We're not under any illusion there. However, it does remove that sort of just that question and that doubt as to why do you need this licensing? What is this licensing? That sounds a bit difficult. And so removing that makes the UK more attractive. Second thing is the faster access to treatments. So by removing these barriers, then we ends up to more opportunity to carry out research in the UK, and that can only be a benefit. So with all the CRDG members also loosely connected to the UK, so we can start to build up intellectual capital in the UK, expertise in the sort of the global growing cannabinoid R&D space, and bring it back to the UK. And then thirdly, sort of just maintaining that position, both as the UK is both a sort of a leading jurisdiction for life sciences as a whole, but specifically specifically for cannabinoid research, and that has to be exciting. That sort of we are ultimately sort of providing huge economic and health benefits to the UK. So that's in a nutshell. Sort of my view from the legal sort of standpoint on the report. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Rob. I think, it's as you say, it's really about showcasing the UK now as well, and as fed on from Andy's talk as well, about how we need to be really removing these barriers now to get the R&D on board. We've also been joined by Clarissa as well, which is wonderful. She's been able to join us. So Clarissa is another member, part of OCT as well. So I wonder, Clarissa, because I know you're super passionate about this area as well, if you'd like to just introduce yourself to the group, and maybe if you have any further thoughts or additional thoughts from the experience with licensing in the Home Office that you'd like to add before we take some questions.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks everybody for joining and for taking the time. You're absolutely right. This is a subject I'm hugely passionate about. I've been in the field, in the sector, for not as long as some on this call, I have to say, looking at Andy in particular. But in the last 6 years, I've been at OCT, almost 6 years I've been at OCT, and obviously started in the role that Rob is currently in the general counsel role. So it was my responsibility straight out of the gate to deal with the Home Office and get that license in place, renew that license actually, for the business. And we've been fortunate enough to have it renewed relatively pain-free, I should say, every year since then. However, I think the challenge with being under the remit of the Home Office is, as I'm sure others have said before I joined, that it does give that sort of slight question mark, that slight nervousness from an investor point of view as to why we're being licensed by the department that also controls firearms when we're a pharma company doing standard pharmaceutical research. So there's that question in my mind. But in terms of the day-to-day experience, it is a rigorous process to get a license. I don't think it should be different, actually, in terms of the process and the checks and balances that should be in place. I just don't think the Home Office is necessarily the right place to be conducting those checks and balances. And I think, as Rob was saying, moving over to the Department for Health and the MHRA specifically would really streamline things and open up a whole set of opportunity that isn't currently there or isn't perhaps being maximised. I think the Home Office, as many of us on the call will know, have a hugely broad remit here. And, this isn't necessarily something that is very high up on the list, or it certainly doesn't feel very high up on the list. And that might be quite right for if you look at the sort of broad remit of the office itself. Whereas if you can align it with the Department of Health and the MHRA, who are already checking and approving the trials and the work that we want to do in this space, that feels to me like a much better bedfellows and more kind of practical way of doing things.
Brilliant. Thank you, Clarissa. Yes, I mean, it's echoed, this move to the MHRA by, everyone probably on this call, was certainly Andy, Rob, and yourself and our members as well, other members at the CRDG. We've got some time for questions now, actually. So I was saying, if anybody that's viewing wants to submit questions, and I think probably pop them in the chat box and I can sort of monitor them that way. But we've got some questions that have come in beforehand. And, I know that this move to the MHRA, that's kind of almost like our end goal in a way, or the dream that we want to be able to achieve. But in the interim, do we feel that there may be a better way, better environment without moving licensing responsibility from the Home Office? Do we think that the Home Office is aware of the economic impact of these delays? Are there ways of helping them currently in order to help with the licensing procedure? Because as Andy said, it's no free pass here that companies are after. And as you said, Clarissa, we need these checks in place. It's just, how to get the ball rolling, because, Andy was talking about not even being able to get conversations with the Home Office. So I wonder if I'll start with you, Andy, maybe, because you talked about not being able to get conversations, and then Clarissa's saying that, it's a strict process, but she has been able to renew licenses. So, I mean, Andy, do you feel that, there is a way that we can create a better environment within the Home Office without that move through to the MHRA straight away, just to get the process moving quicker in the UK?
I think it will be a struggle, I'll be honest, to stay with the Home Office, given what we now know. We're all on a learning journey. You know, none of us have worked in the Home Office, but I think having the ex-head of controlled drug strategy from the Department of Health on the team, John, has been a big eye-opener, because what he was actually saying was that, and I made that point but rather badly before, but from what I could understand, the Home Office is a constrained environment on how many employees they can have and how they can sort of expand. It's a sort of top-down approach, whereas what he was saying with the MHRA and Department of Health is it's a bottom-up approach. So if there are companies, which we would hope by this type of move coming would start to come to the UK, so more controlled drug licenses being required, then obviously the MHRA could then up staff so that we could get that sort of level of support that we need. And I think that's the key word for me, which is why I don't think it would work in the Home Office. The Home Office is, by its very nature, not necessarily interested in giving support. It will often just refer you back to the Misuse of Drugs Act and ask you to make your own determination on these things, which is incredibly difficult when you've got a department that effectively is administering the law, who can't give you or won't give you advice on something that you want to ask them. And that's why I think they won't engage in conversations, quite frankly, because it doesn't help them and it doesn't help you, because I don't think they can give you those answers. But I just want to draw two parallels to two other jurisdictions I've worked with that are very different. One is Canada, Health Canada, and the other is the Irish medical regulator. And both of those actually look after their country's interests on controlled substances as well. And working with them is a much more defined and easier pathway than it has ever been with the Home Office. For instance, in Canada, they are a little bit like the US, where they're bound by a 30-day review. So you know that within 30 days, you're either going to get additional questions to supplement what you're requesting from them, or you're going to get an acceptance or a fail of the request. That's incredibly useful when you're dealing with business, because it means that you could move on after 30 days, find somewhere else, or move forward. So I think there is a general consensus, there's a general misconception that you can't move this from the Home Office because we're bound in by World Health Organization or United Nations treaties. Well, I say one of the reasons I think we exited from Europe was to give ourselves more freedoms. So I'm not saying this is a European thing, but if we're wanting to take that approach of making ourselves a unique identity, I'm sure there are something, if there is a reason why it can't move easily, there'll be a way around that, because as I say, I've seen it with Ireland and I've seen it with Canada. If for whatever reason they couldn't move it to the MHRA, then I would revert back to what I keep saying, which is the Home Office has on its desk 3 recommendations from its own independent scientific advisory board, things like a research designation for a compound. So that would mean that Artelo or OCT dealing with a particular substance would be allowed to deal with that substance as though it wasn't controlled for the purposes of while we were researching it. That would be a useful concept to explore, because that would then take away from what Rob was saying before, which is when we need to go out and find partners. And I don't have off the top of my head how many partners we've worked with on these projects, but I would say it would top 50 plus. So we're talking about 50 different companies that currently would need to have a Schedule 1 license to deal with one of our compounds. That could go away if they adopted this research designation. So I think there could be improvements made, but not the material improvements that we're looking for could be made, and it wouldn't get rid of, as Clarissa said, the shadow, if you wish, of working within an organization that really is trying to license firearms and stop it. And as Rob said, stopping drug misuse. Well, there is no misuse with any of our compounds, and there are no firearms involved. So I don't see really why I have to be dealing with the Home Office, which can't necessarily do that job. I'll say one more thing, which was, Clarissa's given her perspective, and I think repeating licensing procedures does tend to be a little easier, because you've probably had to have your SOPs in place. You've already got a license. You've had your visit or your main visit. But I thought carefully with the Times article when being interviewed by the journalist, and I go back to this word that I use, nightmare. Of course, they choose the most provocative word, but it has been a nightmare working with them. That's how strongly I feel about working with that organisation to get this up. And I think by having people like George Freeman on the team, ex-Life Sciences Minister, Trevor Jones, who's obviously had a magnificent career within the pharmaceutical industry and is a known quantity when it comes. I'm just hoping that these people can connect with the right ministers and the right government officials to really push this agenda, because it's not just going to help us on the CRDG. It's going to help all of the companies dealing with the new psychoactive substances, which is, as we all know, getting a lot of traction at the moment for helping very difficult, intractable mental health conditions. And the thing is that, you know, once people see a pathway forward in this space, I would suspect that there are ultimately other classes of medicines that have been labelled as no medicinal use. Well, there won't be any medicinal use if nobody can research them, of course. And it will just open up that ability to ensure that we're able to offer medicines and new innovations to patients that currently are in a really difficult spot. Both OCT and ourselves are researching in the area of peripheral neuropathy. Go and speak to any clinician treating a peripheral neuropathy patient and ask them how much they need a new medicine for their patients, and you'll be, you know, you'll be humbled by some of the pain and some of the discomfort and some of the life-changing effects that happen to these patients that can't be currently helped. And really what we're saying is we believe we've got the tools in our toolbox to help them, and we just want the UK government to make that pathway as easy as possible for us to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, that's really powerful, Andy. And as you mentioned, to have George Freeman and Trevor Jones, so renowned in, you know, within the industry, within life sciences as well, to really try and help smooth this pathway a little bit more, is a very powerful group that we've assembled and that we're looking to grow as well, because there's certainly strength in numbers and the message that we can put out there. So I wonder, Clarissa, if you've got anything to add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, Andy's absolutely right. The renewal process, once provided you don't need somebody to come and check your premises again, is more straightforward, and that is largely what we at OCT have been involved in. We've had the same troubles as Andy when trying to get licenses in place for partners that we want to work with. New applications are really difficult to get through the system, and you know, Andy's right, it takes a very long time. In fact, when we renewed our license with a change of premises and had to have a visit, it took 18 months before anybody could come out. I mean, and now because we have a license in place, that's okay, because it allows you to carry your old license over so we could continue our activity. But had that been the barrier for us starting any research, suddenly our business isn't viable, because investors aren't waiting 18 months, not paying 18 months worth of overhead without any progress, because that's just not a viable business. So that's incredibly frustrating that the system doesn't work. And actually, if you dig into, and I suspect many people on this call have been through the forms and the process, but if you look at the forms and the process, they genuinely bear almost no relation to what we're doing, right? It's so obvious that we're in the wrong place here. You know, you have to, I don't know if you're in the same boat, Andy, but, you know, we spend a lot of time in the notes section of the form explaining all the reasons why we can't put ticks in the boxes that they're expecting there to be ticks in the boxes of, because it's not fit for purpose. Now, when I say we've had an easy time, I guess it's because we've had a license in place and we've had it renewed within a kind of reasonable time frame, and it hasn't held me up that much. My partner's very different scenario. We have had to not work with people because the licenses just haven't come in through in time, and that's incredibly frustrating. So yeah, You know, it's a really difficult position to be in and feels completely unnecessary. It's a completely unnecessary handbrake that we're applying to an industry that is really set up, but for that, to deliver some serious growth and innovation for the UK at a time when I think we can all agree we most need it.
I mean, it sounds like they're not even aware, though, as well, of the impact that by not prioritising companies that are doing clinical trials is having on patients, medications, companies, industry, income.
I think that's right. I don't think they are aware, but I also don't necessarily think that's in their remit either. You know, if you're looking at the range of things that they're licensing, I am pleased that they're focusing carefully on who to license firearms to, right? I don't want them to deprioritize that necessarily. It just goes to illustrate yet again that we're just in the wrong place, that we should be you know, and under the sort of jurisdiction of the MHRA and the Department of Health. And Andy points out the sort of permitted pathway, which is already a recommendation in front of them, would massively free up a huge, you know, a backlog and a huge amount of activity, I guess.
Yeah. So any other thoughts to add to that before we move on to another question? We're okay, brilliant. So we've had a question from Matt, MedCan Support. I don't know, Matt, whether you can unmute and you would like to ask your question live. And I think we'll probably, because it's around RCTs, we'll start with Andy on the question side. So thanks, Matt, if you'd like to.
Yeah, so it's not MedCan Support anymore, we're MedCan Family Foundation. But yeah, it's just to kind of highlight, so from my perspective, from patient, my child has refractory epilepsy. We've been privately prescribed now since 2019 a full spectrum cannabinoid formulation, which has worked marvellously well. However, as everyone will know, to access that on the NHS is next to impossible. So kind of the question is, moving forward, is innovation around full spectrum medicines and the use of innovation around research. Obviously, RCT is the standardized method of testing these medicines. But in full spectrum, that's becoming an issue. So how do we get around that? Is there talks of other forms of research that NICE or MHRA would accept to bring about licensing in those particular, in that cohort of medicines?
No, that's a really good point you've made, and obviously this report was more around the controlled drugs aspect of, and I think what you're asking is the other development part.
Yeah, it's the next,
which is
the next step.
How can we improve on the clinical trials process? So I mean, if I can, I'll sort of take it in layers, which is you've probably noted, and I do understand, because I come from a reasonably well-rounded cannabinoid background about full spectrum products versus synthetics, and you've happened upon a call where you're working with two companies, both in the clinic with synthetic products, and you're probably scratching your head there saying, well, hang on, I think these full spectrum ones are the ones to go for, and that may well be the case, but at least from a pharmaceutical perspective, they're a much more challenging product line to develop, and that's because I'm sure as they grow the product each 3 cycles, that sort of chemavir has the chance to destabilize and grow a different proportion. So control of the cannabinoids and terpenes and all of the other wonderful things that I do believe exist in cannabinoids is very challenging from a pharmaceutical perspective, which is probably why more of a reason actually why you're not seeing RCTs in that space as much as you might hope to see. And I think that's because when we've looked at it, and I've worn different hats in the cannabinoid space, I've ended up at Artelo Biosciences, but along the way I've worked with a number of companies also wanting to do RCTs with full spectrum products. And that challenge actually is probably less of an issue with home office control, because actually in that space, the change in the legislation in 2018 for the cannabis-based medicinal products makes it a bit easier, not very easy. And the reason for this is it controls when you're in the clinical trial, which is wonderful. So that Schedule 2, moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 is wonderful for the clinical trial aspect. But imagine the work that has to go in to ensuring that product, before it gets tested in a patient, has the right amount of cannabinoids and terpenes within the product. And does that remain stable? If so, for how long? What's the pharmacokinetics when you give that to an animal species to predict what that might do to man? Now, all of that work actually isn't covered by the 2018 amendments. All of that work still would have to be under a Schedule 1 license. So you can see here a bit of an interplay. If I wanted to now start and help you and your team, your family run an RCT with this medicine, the first thing we'd be talking about is who in the UK has a Schedule 1 license. And you may say, well, no, it's Schedule 2 because it's actually not at that point. We need to do a lot of work, 2 to 4 years worth of work, I would suggest.
Yeah, this is quite a few that we're working with that have exactly that problem. It's a Schedule 1. How do we push the research? Even universities that we're talking with. The use of, recently we've been to Sussex and they've got a really interesting study in electrophysiology, etc. But it's all the licensing, which is, as you say, is a massive headache. So but then we go on to the actual clinical trial, that the RCT model isn't appropriate. So the people that miss out are the children. And
100%.
So it's how do we push government towards looking at innovation? The RCT model is great in some aspects, but we need to be looking at other forms, to look at effectively what's a botanical.
Absolutely. So I'm going to pass on to Clarissa, but I'll leave you with this, which is one, I think the initiative we're driving with the Home Office to MHRA change will be beneficial for exactly what you've just talked about, because it will help those medicines get to the start line, to the green light start line for whatever clinical trial it needs to do much quicker. So I think it will support the second thing is when it comes to innovation in clinical trials, I totally agree. We could take the case to MHRA. It's an independent regulator, and we could talk to them about what's acceptable, particularly alongside NICE. The big issue there, and we've got to have our eyes open to the big sort of global scene, is that clinical trials and the way you measure them are actually standardized by the ACH, which is the International Committee of Harmonization. So that pretty much says what you do in pharmaceutical companies. If you do it in the UK, it'll be accepted by the US, wider in Europe and Japan. So the problem with doing something bespoke and unique for the UK is that it is likely not to be recognised in any other market outside of the UK.
Oh, yeah.
You now have to then have the reality check of money in versus money out for any company doing that development. And there probably isn't, particularly with NICE at the helm, there probably isn't enough sort of upside from doing a UK only development to warrant even going down that innovation path for the majority of companies with a model. Because what tends to happen is when I run my trial in the UK, or Clarissa runs her trial in the UK, we're hoping that trial data can be spread wide. We can go and talk to the FDA about it, to the EMEA, Health Canada, and everyone goes, was it run under ICH? Yes, it was. Okay, well, we'll talk to you. So the problem with innovative models is that they're probably only innovative for the UK, and that probably won't have enough of an economic balance within it to warrant a full-on, let's just hit this medicine for the UK. That's my perspective. Clarissa? Oh,
Clarissa, you're on mute, Clarissa, and we've just got a minute or two left. So yeah, we're done.
I'll be very quick. So I tend to agree with everything that Andy's just said, but I wonder whether there is, and it's a bigger project, and I'm afraid it's probably a longer term project. But when we're talking about innovation, I don't think we can talk about it on that national level, because you're right, Andy, you're not going to get money in, money out. The balance isn't going to work, right? So where we need to go to the ICH, and we need to go, look, RCTs aren't working for this area. What can we do? How, collaborate with us to tell us how we can develop a protocol that addresses the issues that Andy was quite rightly pointing out, and that also allows us to bring these drugs in, because we've got a serious unmet medical need and some real world data that demonstrates efficacy potentially. How do we marry the two? And I think we need to look at it on that bigger stage, and then that's how you're going to get the investor backing and the company.
So because we're working with multiple epilepsy charities, and what's coming out, and this is particularly in rare epilepsies as well, the message is that we need innovation and personalized medicines. Cannabinoids falls into that category of personalized medicines. These epilepsies are not a one size fits all, and this is why we've seen 30% of epilepsies not see pharmaceuticals appropriate for that particular syndrome. So even my son has LGS and it's Catch-Up syndrome, but no two children are the same with the underlying condition. So it needs to be personalised, and we really feel cannabinoids fits into this model.
Yeah.
It's, as you say, it's an international problem.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're coming to our time for the R&D webinar here, but actually what you've sort of posed, Matt, and what we've started a discussion on is something that is sort of coming into play within the CRDG as well, and a different model. And there are discussions that we are now beginning to have within the CRDG and members and people coming in. So this is certainly an area that we will be picking up on and discussing more of, because, yeah, the RCT is not something that's necessarily going to be supporting patients going forward to have access to the medicines. So I think for now what we'll do is we'll wrap up today's webinar on the R&D side, and just say thank you ever so much to Zach, to Andy at Artelo, to Rob and Clarissa at OCT. And just to say we're a group, an organisation. So if you're interested in further information joining us, then we would love to have you on board. And I know Steve, I think, maybe has a few things to say just before we round off. Steve, you wanting to add in? You're on mute, Steve. So just.
Sorry for that. Yeah, I just want to say thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to everybody who contributed today, to Rob, to Andy, to Clarissa, and to Zach, and to everyone who's taken time out this afternoon to join us. And I think a few people from across the world as well. So thank you for early mornings in Canada and so on. Yeah, so if you want to keep in touch with what we're doing, we're moving forward rapidly the next few months. This is a new group, only established and inaugurated in the summer. It's got a long way to go. But I'm very encouraged by the collaborative work we've undertaken so far, by the team we've assembled, and by the response we've had in the stakeholder world in the UK. So please, if you want to be more involved in our work and understand more about what we're doing, do sign up and register on our website. If you want to understand more about what it means to be a member of this group, and please contact me directly. You'll see my details on the website. And all of that, I'll bid you all a good afternoon. And thanks for today.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.